Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I am Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Allison Elias as our distinguished guest for today's episode. Before we get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Dr. Allison Elias is an assistant professor of business administration at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. She brings the art of communication and negotiation to life in Darden's MBA, EMBA, and executive education programs, and her students notice. Her courses consistently rank in the top 10% of all Darden electives for both content and instructor quality, earning her a Wells Fargo Award for Excellence in Course Materials in 2024 and a nomination for Darden's Outstanding Faculty Award. Her expertise teaches and reaches well beyond the classroom. Professor Allison is a trusted voice in the media, offering commentary for NPR, PBS, CNN, and Newsweek, while her research has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Quartz, and Poets and Calls. Her first book announced her as a standout scholar in the business history, named a Best Summer Book of 2023 in Business by the Financial Times, shortlisted for the prestigious Aggie Prize from the Business History Conference, and designated a must-read on women's history by Columbia University Press. Her academic journey spanned some of the world's most respected institutions. Before joining Darden, she taught at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, and both the S.C. Johnson College of Business and the ILR School at Cornell University, where she earned an Exemplary Teacher Award and recognized for championing gender equality campus-wide. A court-certified mediator since graduate school, she remains actively connected to the conflict resolution community, grounding her teaching in real-world practice. In today's episode, Dr. Allison Elias joins us to explore the core ideas from her acclaimed book, The Rise of Corporate Feminism, Women in the American Office, 1960 to 1990. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Allison Elias to the conversation. Professor Allison, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you. Professor, your book opens with a provocative question. How did feminism in corporate America come to represent the success of the individual executive woman rather than collective progress of the secretary? What was the moment in your research when that paradox truly crystallized for you?
This is such a great question. I was in graduate school earning my PhD in history, initially pursuing research about the EEOC in particular, which is in the book, but not the main part, so the main topic of the book. And I was actually I was interested in how flight attendants had a really influential voice in determining the EEOC, some of the early EEOC cases, which the EEOC is an employment commission here in the U.S. to try to uphold standards of equality as set by a Civil Rights Act of 1964. So there were a lot of flight attendants who forwarded cases and claims that put women's issues on the radar of the EEOC. And at the same time that I was looking into flight attendants as being really influential, the Sheryl Sandberg bestseller Lean In came out, which was a really remarkable book and very impactful for women, but really largely concentrated on the concerns of women in corporate jobs, particularly corporate professionals and executives. And it was against the sort of contrast of what I was studying in the historical archives of what feminism meant to women in the 1960s, alongside this definition of lean-in feminism that was emerging, that I started to see a bit of a development of what feminism had come to mean in corporate America.
Professor, you identified two competing visions of advancing women in the 1960s. One rooted in individual opportunity, the other in collective action for pink-collar workers. How did those two visions coexist in the early years? And when did they begin pulling in opposite directions?
Yeah, I think that the paradox of equal opportunity for women is that there is an idea that if there are no legal barriers to being anything you want to be, then it must be that everyone chooses their own path in life. And this is a bit of an American phenomenon, all not just specific to women, but all the way back from the founding of America and American individualism, that the individual has the power to shape his or her destiny. That's a wonderful idea and wonderful when it works out in practice, but does not always happen that way. While we do not necessarily have legal barriers here in the US against anyone pursuing any type of job, there's still a lot of sociological and historical factors that play into the types of opportunities people have, as well as maybe even what they're interested in pursuing. So what I was seeing in the research was that because women had been segregated into maybe you could say certain types of jobs, and not necessarily those in a managerial or executive setting in corporate America, the idea that maybe women were all in the same boat, so to speak, as far as you could be the most educated woman from an Ivy League school, and you likely had a job in a corporation as a secretary, or you might have been someone with a high school degree who had a job as a secretary in a corporation. So there was that idea that, really women had certain jobs and didn't have the ability to be in more managerial or executive settings. And I sort of argue that as negative as this was for women's opportunities as individuals, it did put women together as a class of sorts, such that they faced a similar barrier and they had more of a chance of organizing together as a labor class in a more collective way. Once we see some legal barriers removed and more you could say HR programs or managerial efforts to move women into places where they had been underrepresented, I argue that this idea of women as a labor class in the corporation started to diminish and split.
Professor, the organization 9 to 5 started as a radical labor group in Boston and quickly grew to tens of thousands of members. What made 9 to 5 such a powerful force initially, and what internal tensions eventually fractured its cross-class feminist alliance?
9 to 5 is so fascinating, and that is the main archival source of the book, is the 9 to 5 labor organization papers at Harvard University at the Schlesinger Library. What I saw is that the women who came together in 9 to 5 really identified concerns that had bothered a lot of women who were working in clerical positions, concerns surrounding lack of respect, maybe lack of promotional opportunities, low pay, being mistreated, even sexually harassed. And so these were all things that as 9 to 5 started to voice them in a very bottom-up type of way in Boston in the 1970s, they really resonated with lots of women across the nation. And so different subsections of 9 to 5 arose in different cities across the nation. And so that was a really powerful, you could say, radical feminist movement, because it was the idea that women were starting to see the ways in which gender was shaping their workplace experience and in many confining and negative ways. 9 to 5 itself had to determine its path forward for action. Some parts of 9 to 5 became actually more in the trade union movement, such that there were women in 9 to 5 who were organizing a separate clerical organization, trade organization for women. And that had a few wins to it, but really largely struggled to gain the membership ranks that would have made it influential and have enough power with employers. At the same time, employers had their own tactics to try to make clerical women feel more respected and included, and including lots of what we know as HR programs now, also back then known as quality of work life programs. So I would say what made 9 to 5 a powerful force initially was it was able to put words to the feelings and experiences women had. But then the internal tensions over what should be the way forward, now that we've identified these problems, were split, with some women wanting to move into collective bargaining and some women wanting to find ways for clerical women to be able to move up in the organizational ranks into a managerial job ladder. So the tension between what was the next way forward really split some of the movement.
Professor, you argue that the feminist embrace of meritocracy and gender-blind equal opportunity actually hardened the low status of the American secretary. Can you walk us through how a principle meant to liberate women ended up reinforcing occupational segregation?
Yes, I think as I was saying earlier, the fact that people were legally occupationally segregated did not allow for the choice of being able to obtain a job as a corporate executive. But I think that once there were feminist publications, voices, and groups and alliances that were helping women gain the tools and understand the importance of how to network and move their way into corporate ranks, um, it in some ways unintentionally cast a light onto women in a secretarial position as if they did not have the same ambition or intelligence of the women who had figured out how to move out of that job. An example would be the famous feminist Gloria Steinem telling women at Smith College in a commencement speech in the 1970s not to learn how to type, because if they learned how to type, they would be relegated to clerical work and then not able to advance themselves into different positions. So what I mean to say by this is that this idea of meritocracy, or that anyone can be whatever they want in life, or that people are sort of sorted into different levels of status based on their talent, ambition, or diligence, actually made solidified a lower status for those in secretarial roles, as if they had chosen to be in a low-paid, occupationally segregated position. In reality, what ended up really happening is that women who did not have access to college educations, or for different class-based socioeconomic reasons had to find work close to family or close to where they grew up, were more likely to move into clerical work because they didn't necessarily have the freedom or the resources to pursue other types of work that required higher education and higher level networking.
Professor, the 1980s seemed to be the move's real hinge, when corporations began deliberately moving qualified women into upper management. How did corporate America use feminism in that decade, and whose interest was it ultimately serving?
It's a great question, Deepak. I think that we could say corporate America really started to integrate feminist principles into its own management practices. And you might not even call them just necessarily feminist principles, but also principles of racial equality too. So as corporate America had to respond to changing laws and the threat of EEOC complaints or even lawsuits, larger departments of human resource management form, and people are actually tasked with trying to meet and even exceed legal regulations for equality. So what this meant is that some women were able to navigate their way to advance in a corporation. And the 1980s was especially pivotal because sexual harassment started to become illegal and started to be something that corporations also feared, they could be taken to court for. And so that, along with pregnancy discrimination, and discrimination, against women with children, became a way that women were able to access upper ranks of corporations in ways they hadn't in previous decades. Obviously, that did serve a lot of interests of women who had ambitions and were able to fulfill mandates to move into corporate leadership. But it did really, in some ways, mitigate or even you could say deafen the ability of labor unions to be effective in corporations for clerical workers, because many of the concerns that would have motivated people to join labor unions and be part of that membership had been taken up by human resource management.
Professor, you examine how automation in the office undercut the bargaining power of clerical workers. How did technological change intersect with gender politics? Did it accelerate the decline of secretarial work as a dignified career path?
It's a great question, and actually, I've gotten a little bit of media coverage lately for threats of AI to clerical work. So I guess economists are now finding that AI threatens secretarial jobs a lot with that kind of automation. We actually saw similar fears of automation in the 1970s and 80s as personal computers started to become mainstays in offices. And so in some ways that you could say that liberated people doing clerical work, meaning now managers and executives could do their own typing, access documents on their computer. On the other hand, it actually took away what I would call some of the variety of tasks and you could say KSAs of what clerical workers did, meaning they really served. You could maybe even argue that many private secretaries served as a chief of staff for an important executive. So they were able to prepare and do a lot of operations, on maybe behind the scenes that helped chief executives do their role better. And so as automation actually tried to actually put people into, you could say, routinize the task of some of what had been considered the more elite jobs of private secretaries, because now instead of having a variety of things they could do to service an executive, there were specific areas of typing pools or people who were doing the typing. And that really took secretarial work and made it into maybe a one-task job, and then companies started to save money, and not every executive had his own private secretary as they started to be able to manage more on their own computer.
Professor, the book spotlights the landmark EEOC versus Sears case, where two feminist historians argues opposite sides about whether occupational segregation reflected women's choices or systemic discrimination. What does that courtroom case reveal about the deeper ideological battle at the heart of your book?
This is one of my favorite court cases in history because for a lot of reasons, but one being that it actually highlighted the importance of history. So we actually had expert testimony from people who study gender history, and so that's great to see the importance of thinking about how historical opportunities might influence current workplace opportunities. But the actual tension, as you mentioned, in the court case is ever enduring. So for the first time, this really brought to light the idea that maybe the preferences and decisions of women on the supply side of a job in the labor pool might be influenced by demand side factors. And what I mean by that is as somebody is growing up, the extent to which maybe they see a job as a possible fit for them, depending on their place in life, their family status, their gender status, all of these things, that actually might influence the extent to which they see that as a path that could be likely to pursue for them. And so what was really at the heart of this case that still remains true is whether the fact that there were fewer women in certain positions at Sears, these sort of higher paid commission positions, was, you could say, at fault and negatively influenced the fact that there were fewer women applying for these positions. So what was the response? I guess theoretically you could say that the question became, what is the responsibility of employers to find people in a hiring pool that matches their maybe demographic representation in society? On one side of the debate is, well, if you don't have many women applying, that's not discrimination. Women are choosing not to apply for those jobs. On the other side of the debate are, historians and social scientists who say, well, if you don't have a lot of women in a certain job, then, maybe it should be the employer's responsibility to try to actively or in a sort of action-oriented way, go out and find people of a certain demographic category to bring into that space to try to achieve equity. So I think that what's fascinating to me about this case is, what is the employer's responsibility here as far as changing societal patterns of work? And I don't think we really even have an answer to that today. We might have a legal answer from EEOC and Sears as to what could be found liable under the law, but I think employers today still struggle with to what extent they need to be active participants in furthering underrepresented groups.
Professor, by the 90s, your research shows that as many white, college-educated women climbed the corporate ladder, clerical work became concentrated among lower socio-economic status women of all races. How did race and class shape who benefited from corporate feminism and who has left behind?
Yes, I think this is a great example of the really invisible and maybe less obvious ways that people get sorted into certain types of jobs depending on socioeconomic factors. The regulations that the EEOC put into place were very good at trying to advance equality among those with certain characteristics, but class-based equality is very hard and very stubborn. In part because it's hard to sort of target people as being of a certain class in the United States, and class is actually you could say something that some people can transition in and out of. Maybe someone grew up in the United States in a lower socioeconomic class, but were able to attain greater wealth, in which case it looks like it's a mutable characteristic that you can change on your own. So back to the question of clerical work, because women who had college degrees were no longer serving as private secretaries to elite corporate executives, they now could enter into the corporation on a managerial job ladder. So they now could completely surpass this stage of clerical work instead of partaking in that as a first step and then moving into management. My argument there is that if clerical work had become a first step on the way to management, then maybe we would have been able to see people without as much class or race privilege start there and then be able to be advanced up the ladder. However, the fact that women, we should in some ways celebrate, right, that women then could enter the corporation onto a different ladder, the male-dominated, historically male-dominated managerial ladder. But it meant that there was not really going to be a bridge between those in clerical work and those in managerial work, even though a lot of what people are doing in clerical work, you could argue is training for management work, and they're gaining a lot of valuable skills.
Professor, you posed some striking counterfactual questions in your introduction. What if more men had entered secretarial work, or if HR had reimagined lines of progression to move secretaries into management? Which of those what ifs do you find most compelling or more historically plausible?
What a fascinating question. Thank you for that question. No one has ever asked me that. I think actually the latter would be the most historically plausible, which is that HR maybe had reimagined lines of progression. So HR made very specific choices about how it was going to institute equality in the workplace, and those you could argue were based on EEOC and other legal guidelines about affirmative action. It is very hard to get men to enter into female-dominated fields. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but we even see that today in healthcare. In the United States, one of the more accessible, higher paying jobs is working in nursing or as a physician's assistant. Nursing being a historically female dominated position that is increasingly becoming filled with ranks of men because of the pay. But I think it's very hard to, unless men for some reason prefer that work, maybe they're progressive enough to realize they want to take care of people and be supportive to those facing health challenges. I think it's difficult to get men to get excited about entering into female dominated work unless they have to for economic reasons.
Professor Ellison, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. From lean-in to debates about equal pay and the so-called girl boss era, the tensions you trace from 1960 to 1990 feel very much alive today. What do you want readers, especially business leaders and HR professionals, to take away from this history and apply to their organizations right now?
I really would like people to think about the what you could call maybe feminine qualities of work or feminine styles to leadership as being valuable. And so, in other words, just because a woman takes on what has historically been a men's position doesn't mean that she has to do the job in a certain way or in a certain masculine leadership style. I'd like professionals to realize that there could be historical disadvantages to operating in a more feminine leadership style, but that in our era of more collaborative and servant leadership, there could be also a lot of benefits to the organization too. So I guess I would like to make sure that the movement of women into leadership positions doesn't negate the value of feminine characteristics, what have historically been feminine characteristics of caretaking and concern for others.
Dr. Allison Elias, this conversation has been a masterclass in seeing history, not just as the past, but as a mirror for the present. The Rise of Corporate Feminism is essential reading for anyone who wants to understand how workplaces were shaped and how we might reshape them more equitably. Thank you, Professor Ellison, for sharing your time and fascinating research publication with us today. This has been a truly enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you for featuring a book like this as part of your group of very notable authors and books on Businesstalk, because a lot of times books about women get characterized into sort of women-only types of podcasts, but I really appreciate this being integrated into a broader discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.